The United States and Russia will enter into a round of negotiations on issues such as nuclear arms control and also the Ukrainian tensions in Geneva next month. The talks have been scheduled to be held on the 10th of January, and they'll focus on a whole host of security guarantees that Russia is demanding from the United States. Now, according to reports within the Russian media, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has said that talks on security assurances and the Ukrainian conflict will top the agenda in the Moscow-Washington bilateral. The West, remember, is alarmed over Russia's build-up of troops along the Ukrainian border, although Russia has insisted that it has no intentions of invading into Ukraine. It has also asserted that it is facing threats from its neighbor, and many perceive this as a Russian attempt to create a pretext for invasion. Now, in a video call earlier this month, US President Joe Biden warned Putin that Russia will face severe consequences if it attacks Ukraine. Now, remember, Russia has published its security demands to raise the pressure on the United States and also its allies to negotiate a security deal. And ahead of the engagement, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has indicated that he's considering a whole host of different options if the West fails to meet his push for security guarantees. When asked to specify as to what Moscow's response could be, Vladimir Putin said that it will entirely depend on the military proposals.
Но я надеюсь, что все-таки и мы же не для того, чтобы что-то забаллотировать и что-то прекратить с точки зрения этого дипломатического процесса предложили, а для того, чтобы достичь дипломатического переговорного результата, закрепленного, как я уже говорил, юридически в рамках тех документов, которые мы предложили.
And Russia is fiercely opposed to Ukraine's inclusion into the military alliance of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO. Last week, Russia unveiled its wish list of security proposals, and the list included the demand of NATO giving up any military activity in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Russia also wants NATO to roll back its military deployments in Central and Eastern Europe. The United States and its allies have refused to offer Russia the kind of guarantees that Vladimir Putin wants on Ukraine. And the West's cited NATO principle that membership is open to any qualifying nation. Moscow and NATO's representatives are now expected to meet on the 12th of January, while parallel broader discussions are also set to be held between Russia and the OSCE regional security body. The meeting will, of course, take place on the 13th of January, amidst the standoff between Russia and the Western powers. Russian forces have held military exercises to practice repelling an airstrike. Nearly about 1,000 troops took part in the operation, and Moscow considers that the threat of a new missile crisis is something that it has to contend with very, very seriously. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what's in fact happening at the border between Russia and Ukraine, and as to how talks could likely proceed, we are joined in firstly by our correspondent Julia Chapman, who's joining us live from Moscow. And we're also joined by Mr. Andreas Umlund, who's an analyst in Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. But Julia, let me begin by asking you this. Talks are slated to be held on the 10th of January next month, where the issue of what is happening at Ukraine is likely to come up. Now, Russia has made it very clear that it has put forth its demands. How likely is it, do the Russians think, will the West be willing to concede to any of these demands that the Russians have put forth?
I think it's unlikely that any of those headline demands put forward in these draft agreements by Russia a couple of weeks ago are likely to be met by the Americans or indeed by NATO, because there were two separate draft agreements that Russia exclusively drafted by itself, putting forward these proposals to shift European security as the situation stands at the moment. And as you mentioned, some of those demands include halting any NATO expansion, limiting military activity in Eastern Europe and on the Russian side as well. Those pacts, as put forward by the Russians, would affect both sides, of course. But certainly in areas where they have put forward proposals for encouraging more dialogue between the two sides, that's going to be the kind of area where we will see some engagement from the US and other NATO partners. But certainly the list that has been put forward by Russia is unlikely to be met in any kind of substantial way. But we have heard from the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov, saying that he hopes that this is the starting point for negotiations on this wish list that Russia has put forward. From the other side, it's more likely that they will simply be trying to get Russia to the table to try to create some sort of forum for dialogue to prevent any kind of incursion of Ukraine going forward, with big concerns about a military buildup on the Ukrainian border. Certainly it has been the position of the US administration under Joe Biden to engage in dialogue with Russia. We've certainly seen more of that this year, most recently with the online summit between Joe Biden and President Putin. And this meeting on January 10th will be another result of that dialogue. It's officially a strategic security dialogue as established during their Geneva summit in June. But of course, the remit of that will go much beyond the nuclear weapon issues, but also will include the security demands put forward by Russia.
Absolutely, indeed. Do continue to stay on with this, and let me also bring in Mr. Andreas Umland on this story. Mr. Umland, this of course is an extremely hard sort of a situation that is presently unfolding. What do you think are Russia's intentions here?
Well, there is, I think, a change of terminology here, in that Russia speaks about security guarantees, which is, of course, absurd. Russia is one of the militarily most secure countries of the world, being a nuclear superpower, which has more nuclear warheads than any other country. It has one of the 3 largest conventional military armies. It has troops in several countries around Russia, and 3 of them against the expressed will in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine against the expressed will of the government. So this is basically a claim for a Russian sort of new empire that is formulated here in terms of allegedly deadly security risks for Russia.
Now, the Russians have put it abundantly clear that they don't want Ukraine to join the NATO's military alliance, although Ukraine has expressed its desire to be a part of the NATO. This, Russia says, is a clear red line for them, and that is what is threatening their security. Do you not think that that's an issue that the Russians need to get some kind of an assurance of from the West?
Well, Russia has also troops in the neighboring country of Moldova since 1992, and Moldova has put in its constitution a bloc-free status and thereby excluded an accession to NATO. So for Ukraine, there isn't much of a difference, a NATO perspective, not a NATO perspective. If you look at the region, this is basically just a justification. In this case of Ukraine, NATO is the justification for putting your troops into a neighboring country. Just to remind you, NATO is already several kilometers away from Putin's birthplace, St. Petersburg. The little country of Estonia is a full member of NATO, and is only very little away from St. Petersburg. So this whole issue about an allegedly deadly NATO accession threat is overdrawn, and most of all, there is no talk so far of any NATO accession in the West. This is a made-up story that relies to an old document from 2008, where NATO has said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, but there have been no plans to start the accession process.
All right, and Julia, if I can bring you in on this, we've spoken a lot in terms of what Russia has been doing in terms of its troop build-up, but also if you could shed some light in terms of what the mood is like in Ukraine, because it is sitting at this point of time with nearly about 100,000 Russian troops, very well armed along its border. How is it preparing to deal with this crisis? Right, Julia, if you can hear me, my question to you was, what is happening within Ukraine as the Russians have been building up their troops? 100,000 Russian troops are stationed along the border with Ukraine. So how is Ukraine planning to deal with this crisis? All right, I think there's a bit of an issue with the line with my colleague Julia Chapman there. We'll try to fix that line. But this, of course, is a bit of a huge crisis that is unfolding at this point of time. And Mr. Umlin, if I can get you back in on this, this, of course, is an issue that Russia and the United States can, of course, go back and forth on. But one of the demands that the Russians have put forth is that they want the NATO alliance to go back to what it was like, in 2008. Russia has said that there are new countries that have now become a part of NATO, and this is what is giving it some serious security concerns.
Yes, as I said, I mean, this is the Russian narrative, but it is something that has been going on since 1999, when there was the first large enlargement of NATO, when Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic became members of NATO. Then other East European countries became members of NATO. And now there is a membership perspective for Ukraine and Georgia. So this is an old story that has now suddenly been put on the table. There have been until recently also very close relations between NATO and Russia within the so-called NATO-Russia Council that had meetings on an almost daily basis on several levels. But now Russia is seeing NATO enlargement, which is not yet actually scheduled as a major threat. And I don't think that there will be an official backtracking by NATO from its 2008 declaration in which it said that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO.
All right, very interesting. It remains to be seen as to how things can in fact move forward here. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Andres Umlin, and also to Julia Chapman for joining us on this broadcast. This, of course, remains a very contentious issue between Russia and the United States. Both of these sides have in fact made their stance pretty clear, so it remains to be seen as to how the negotiations will proceed on the 10th of January when the negotiations are held. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.